What a fitting segue into the main event at lunch. We'll have three speakers. The conversation between Congressman Roy and Crenshaw will be moderated by my colleague and close friend, Rob Henneke. Many of you know Rob as our general counsel, as the head of our Center for the American Future. It's our litigation center. We're one of the few right-of-center groups that decides that in order to put government back in the box, that you got to sue the government sometimes. Rob's a real specialist in that. One thing, yes, he deserves a round of applause for that work. You may know that Rob finished law school here at the University of Texas. What you may not know, and this is a plug for the liberal arts, which get decried sometimes, is that he's also a graduate of Georgetown University, I think in British literature, right? Yes. So if you've ever heard Rob speak and you're thinking, man, that guy's really eloquent, UT may deserve some credit, but something probably happened before then. With that said, Rob will be coming up here momentarily, but I thought it would be special for the two congressmen, thank you for letting me assume this, that you would be introduced by someone who's always been special to us at TPPF, someone who is known as the Gentleman of Congress, having served 32 years from the 21st District in Texas, and that is our very own Lamar Smith.
Kevin, thank you for that introduction. And it is both a pleasure and a privilege to introduce both Dan Crenshaw, who is sitting to my left right over here, I think, and Chip Roy. It's a pleasure because both are great members of the Texas delegation. And it's a privilege because both are conservatives by conviction, not convenience. And that's important. Dan Crenshaw represents the 2nd Congressional District around the Houston area and has a master's in public administration from Harvard. He was an officer in the Navy SEALs and was deployed 5 times overseas. He serves on 2 committees in Congress, Homeland Security and the Budget Committee. On Homeland Security, he has earned a reputation as a national spokesman for our national security. And of course, he's become, as you've probably seen, a national spokesman for the Republican Party as well. I oftentimes think of Dan as exemplifying what was said about President Eisenhower, and that is that he was gentle in manner, but strong in deed. And I think that describes Dan Crenshaw. Now, speaking of gentle, gently is how one should introduce his successor, Chip Roy, who I'm glad is up here. Chip represents, of course, the 21st District of Texas. It stretches from Austin to San Antonio and includes much of the Hill Country. Chip holds a law degree from the University of Texas, and before he went to Congress, he was both a deputy U.S. attorney and assistant Attorney General here in Texas, but most importantly, he worked for TPPF. Chip serves on 3 committees in Congress, the Oversight and Reform Committee, the Veterans Affairs Committee, and the Budget Committee as well. Not too long ago, and this made national media, not too long ago, he single-handedly stopped Speaker Pelosi from trying to pass a $17 billion bill without a recorded vote. Chip heard about it. He was already at the airport. He ran back to the House floor and demanded the recorded vote. So we have him to thank for at least occasionally keeping Speaker Pelosi honest. Besides service on the Budget Committee, both Chip and Dan have something in common, and that is that they both have confronted mortality. Dan, of course, on the battlefield, and Chip in his successful fight against cancer. And as a result, both have not only survived, both have thrived. They are here today to talk about Washington, D.C. and what's going on in Washington, otherwise known as draining the swamp. So please give both a warm welcome, Chip and Dan.
Long time no see.
Good to see you. Nice to see you.
Good.
Thanks for being here. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Rob Henneke. I'm the General Counsel here at the Foundation. Let me be another one to welcome you to our policy orientation. Congressman Smith, thank you for that introduction. Gentlemen, we're thrilled to have you here. Congressman Crenshaw, thank you for joining us for your first policy orientation. We hope to have you back. So, guys, slow week in D.C. I know nothing much is going on in Washington right now. But look, we know the impeachment proceedings are going on. I'm going to get your thoughts on that in a minute. But because the Texas Public Policy Foundation is a policy-focused research institute, I wanted to start by asking for y'all's comment on immigration and border security. And to frame this, there was a recent poll done in Texas where 80% of Texans call immigration a crisis. And it's not a partisan issue. 64% of Democrats agree. 75% of independents agree. And as Kevin mentioned, we were yesterday down in the Rio Grande Valley sector of the border on a tour hosted by the Border Patrol. And there's two things I learned that stuck out with me. First of all, with credit to President Trump and the men and women in uniform with Border Patrol, right now the construction on the wall is proceeding forward where by 2021, there will be an additional 105 miles of border wall constructed in the Rio Grande Valley sector, which is ground zero for the fight over immigration. But we also learned that at the same time, right now, every week, the cartels just in this sector make $23 million a week from human trafficking smuggling. It's outrageous. And I know that both of you have been leaders on this issue, and Congressman Crenshaw, and starting with you, looking at the difference between last year's migrant surge and where we are today, satisfied is not the right word, but are we making an impact on the challenge to secure the border?
We have made a lot of progress. I'd be really curious about that poll, 64% of Democrats saying it's a crisis. They might have a different take on it than a Republican, though. It depends on how that question is asked. And I'm not just nitpicking the poll. That's actually a very important question, and it's a very important thing to understand how people think about this and the difference between how the left and the right think about this issue and what is fundamentally the issue of sovereignty and cultural sustainability. So, because I know a lot of Democrats who would absolutely say the immigration issue is a crisis, but they mean something totally different than I mean, right? They mean that immigrants aren't being treated well. That's what they mean. So we have to take that with a grain of salt, and it's important. But have we made progress? Yeah, we have. The wall being built is a good thing, but that's not what's making progress. That's not what's actually stopping illegal immigration. That's good for security. Because Border Patrol needs walls in certain places, because for them security is threefold. It's technology, personnel, and barriers. And they need to have barriers over here so that they can focus over here. Okay, so it's a good thing. It's a necessary part of the equation, but the real reason we've had success is because of the Remain in Mexico policy, the migrant protection protocols, and Mexicans working with us. The Mexican government right now is sending people back to Guatemala. They're defending their own southern border. And they're doing that at the request of our government. And that's not only that, but I had a meeting with Secretary of DHS, and they've been very successful in changing our process so that when people come across, it's not a catch and release program anymore. So it doesn't really matter if it's 1,000 people crossing illegally every month or 1 million. It doesn't actually matter. What actually matters is whether we enforce the law and whether the 1 million people are sent back properly or whether that 1,000 people is sent back once they're caught. That's what actually matters. And we've managed to vastly decrease the number of people that are just released back into the population. And so there is some solid progress being made.
Thank you. Thank you. Chip, where do you see that things stand right now on this issue?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back at TPPF. Thank you. Great to be here on the stage with my friend Dan. It's an honor to work with Dan, and we've got a great freshman class.
Likewise.
And glad to be here with Dan. I've been working on this border security and immigration issue for a long time as a lawyer for Senator Cornyn on the Senate Judiciary Committee, as a staffer for Governor Perry. What we have been facing was a crisis of epic proportions last spring that our Democratic colleagues, I think Dan was kind of asking that question about the polling, they refused to acknowledge there was a crisis. We would go down and we'd give floor speeches on the floor of the House. And, you know, this is a nonpartisan entity here at TPPF, but we talk about conservative policies and making sure we're doing the right thing. We would go to the floor of the House and we would be told that we were lying about the crisis at the border. Yet you would go down to the border and you would see firsthand what was actually happening. So we've made great strides, but let's remember at peak what we were dealing with. Last year in the fiscal year, we had upwards of 900,000 apprehensions in one fiscal year, of whom approximately 600,000 were caught and released. And that is because of a very broken system that we've been managed to turn back with this return to Mexico policy, but it's still very broken with respect to some of the underlying structures with asylum, with our Flores decision that's the catch and release sort of genesis. And there are things that we need to do to fix that, but those numbers are pretty extraordinary. And when you go down to the border and talk to Border Patrol, and you realize that in Laredo, they have a 75-mile stretch where they have 2 miles of navigable roads along the Rio Grande River. So you're down there, if you're a Border Patrol agent, it's 11 o'clock at night, you have no cell signal, you have no radio signal, you're by yourself, and you can't see the river because the cane is too thick, and you only have 2 miles you can drive your car along the 75-mile stretch. Anybody here want to sign up for that gig? And that's what we're asking them to do. So we've been trying to work hard to highlight these issues, get them more resources, get them border barriers, and an actual fence that does make a difference. And Dan and I were down there. One of the first things we did together was last January, about a year ago right now, give or take, where we went down to McAllen and we saw the actual status on the ground. Went down there late at night. We saw hundreds of people flowing across the border, going straight in to get processed and effectively released. And it's night and day between Brownsville and McAllen because Brownsville has barriers, McAllen does not. So we've been able to work forward on the barriers, which are a part of the solution, but also work with Mexico, the return to Mexico. Dan's right, Guatemala. Yesterday, we're seeing Mexico hold the line down in the southern end of the border. One last point that's important, and I think Dan will agree. I think we're fundamentally winning the message, and Democrats know it. And I think that is at least connected to some of the impeachment mess. Because if you look at where we were last summer, we were pushing right back on them. And the idea that it is compassionate to have open borders is wrong. It is not. That's right. Because I do not accept and will never accept that this is somehow something where Republicans who want to have strong border security, that somehow has a racial tinge to it. It does not. Talk to the women who are being abused on the journey and the little girls that are getting abused on the journey. Talk about the 54 people who were in a stash house in Houston because they were being held for ransom by cartels. Talk about the cartels who have operational control of our border and are endangering lives and bodies hanging from bridges and people being dismembered on the side of roads. This is the reality of our border. With Tamaulipas being a level 4 state under the State Department, it's a no-travel zone. We're talking about helping human beings. We're talking about finding a way to make it better for Mexico and migrants to be able to come here properly and make sure that it's the actual compassionate way to treat migrants coming to the United States instead of the false name of compassion that our Democratic colleagues have been peddling.
No, that's a great point. Dan, I know you agree. Any follow-up thoughts on that?
It's a good point about compassion. I would say, and I would add this point to it as you debate your neighbors. It's not compassionate to allow people to cut in front of the line of legal immigrants. Right. We should be prioritizing legal immigrants. Right? So where's the compassion for them? And I think that's the right message.
Pulling back a bit, Congressman Smith mentioned that in both of your lives you've had life-threatening challenges, which is different than most of your freshman colleagues in the House. Chip, let me start with you. Do you think that gives you a different perspective than your peers in how you're, attacking your role as a member of Congress?
I always hesitate to do any of that kind of comparison. I mean, everybody in this room has been touched by cancer. Many people in this room have served in the armed forces. And by the way, if you're a veteran in the armed forces, would you please stand? Thank you. And in no way, shape, or form would I want to, compare what I went through with cancer to what Dan went through in service to this country. But I do think, obviously, when you go through life events like that, and many of us do, that it does shape your perspective. I know it's shaped mine. I certainly don't give a rip what somebody's saying about me in the press. I don't really care what a certain candidate who shall remain unnamed in this 501c3 organization who might be running against me says about me. I don't care, and I flat out don't care. I'm here because I want to save this country for my kids and my grandkids. I didn't survive cancer in order to pass down something that is less than I inherited. And I'm dedicated every day when I'm in Washington to fighting the fight that I said I would go do. And that's the one thing that gets said to me when I come home to the district is thank you for actually doing what you said you would do. And that shouldn't be such an odd thing to have happen. And I think we've got some new leaders in Congress who are starting to recognize the need to honor our commitments and stand up and do the right thing. And importantly, not just to honor our campaign commitments, but when we're looking our voters in the eye and our constituents in the eye, actually tell them the truth about what we're doing in real time. And stand up and make that message and give it out there. And look, I'm honored to serve the people of Texas 21. And, for me, the impact was obviously going through cancer. It was more about what it meant to my family and what it meant to Kara and what it meant to my two kids. And that's what motivates me to serve publicly is to save this country for them.
Thank you. Thank you. Dan, with your service, of course, there's a number of members of Congress that also have served. But does that give you a different way of looking at policy and government when you've been on the front lines and you've sacrificed so much already in your career?
Well, sure. And there's this debate in this country right now, and it's not a left or right debate. It's on both sides. What America's role is in the world, and you hear a lot of slogans like "Bring the boys home, bring our troops home." They're out there dying, those poor soldiers. No, not poor soldiers. They're volunteers, guys like me who went over, and we went over for one reason, to do the mission that we wanted to do, which is kill America's enemies. And so I do not like it when that argument is used. I do not like vapid sloganeering for foreign policy arguments. There's a good argument to be made that nation building is not within the nation's interest overseas. That's fine. But I carry a very different perspective when it comes to fighting our nation's enemies, and I don't like it when people use the troops as their moral excuse to engage in what often is a very shallow foreign policy debate. So that's a big part of it. I actually want to talk about cancer drugs, because my family has a history with cancer as well. I lost my mom to cancer when I was 10, and I hear a lot from my Democrat opponents about lowering drug prices, and how I didn't vote for that. Well, what I didn't vote for was price controls. Yeah, so that's different. And when you put price controls on a market, you subsequently get less innovation, you get less supply. That's basic economics. The CBO agrees. There was actually a study in California that said if H.R. 3 had been in law for the last, decade or 15 years, only 3 out of 25 new drugs would have been developed. And they did a study on this. That's a pretty big deal. If we had all the drugs we would ever need and all the cures we would ever need, okay, fine, I guess you can make a better moral argument for those price controls, but you can't, because we do need more cures and we do need more innovation, and you can't choke off the market. And how does this pertain to me? I mean, my mom was patient number 1 for Taxotere treatment, which has, and that innovation back in 1993 led to countless cancer drugs that Chip probably used. You wouldn't have those drugs. If you want people to have access to health care, first it has to exist. The thing has to exist before you get access to it. That's the first thing, right? So why would you choke off that kind of innovation? And then you got to work on making it affordable, and there are ways to do that, and then you get access. But it has to be in that order. Democrats don't believe in that order. They think affordability comes before existence, which is stupid.
Let me.
Rob, can I just add?
Yeah, please.
Let me add 30 seconds on that. I was wanting to jump into pharmaceuticals because for me, I was the beneficiary of a trial drug, brentuximab, which was, inserted into my cocktail for Hodgkin's lymphoma down at MD Anderson, and I was very blessed to have it. I said in a hearing at one point, in an oversight hearing on drug pricing, something to the effect of, after one of my colleagues, I believe it was Katie Hill, who's no longer a colleague, but she made some comment about how horrible it was for there to be profit, right? And criticizing how much money a company made and a CEO made. And I was responding to that saying, I hope these companies make lots of money developing drugs that will save my life. Now, do we need patent reform? Do we need them gaming the system? Do we need to fix things? Of course. And Dan and I both support legislation to do that, probably the same legislation. And we'll keep working to improve those things. But the idea that we want to take that kind of innovation out of the market that are transforming and saving lives on a daily basis is just an anathema to the market that we know is doing that here in the United States. And price control is the wrong way to go.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next. So thank you for that segue, Dan. Because in talking about healthcare, there's been some good news, and there's been reports about, in some ways, a little bit of stabilization because there have been alternatives introduced, alternatives like you mentioned to me the other day, direct primary care. Beyond pharmaceuticals, tell me about the importance of those and where you see that as fitting into your vision for what we need to be doing on healthcare.
Yeah, so moving the discussion away from pharmaceuticals and towards what I think is the first step to fixing the healthcare system. I think our basic policy platform when it comes to healthcare should be free market incremental changes that improve your access and affordability and your choice. That should be our basic underlying philosophy. And so how do we do that? What's step one? And notice that's different from saying repeal and replace, right? Because it didn't work. That's the reality. So we got to try something new. I think the first thing we do is primary care. There's a reason that I'm so passionate about this. It's a growing model in Houston, and it works. It's a great. It does a couple of things that we don't currently have. It renews the patient-doctor relationship, and it keeps third parties out of it. So if I were to explain direct primary care very simply, say I'm your doctor and about the size of this room, maybe a little less, you guys would all pay me a subscription service, maybe $75 a month, and you get full access to that primary care doctor. Maybe it's telemedicine, maybe you're texting him or her, whatever it is. Excess specialty care after that wouldn't be covered, but the majority of your needs as a normal, healthy person would be covered. That's the first step to fixing the healthcare system. There's other benefits too. This causes insurance premiums to go down, and we know this. This isn't a theory. We know this will happen because I know direct primary care physicians in Houston who then contract with a company. So now the 500 employees that work for that company, instead of using their insurance for their primary care, they're using this DPC. When that happens, they renegotiate their insurance premiums and premiums go down. They're also providing a mechanism for better preventive care because there's no barrier to going to the doctor anymore. There's no geez, what's my copay? Who's my doctor again? How does that work? I mean, you know how it is. All that's gone. You know who it is, and there's no cost. You just go see them and you ask them the questions that you need. So preventive care is much easier to engage in, and you're keeping people out of emergency rooms. And so what we're working on is, okay, so the model exists and the model works, but only like 3 or 4% of primary care physicians use the model. How do we get to 100%? Well, you do that by creating, and this is where it gets complicated, because the end goal is that this is just the model. Right, that you go on your phone, you type in your zip code, you have a list of DPCs that are there. Maybe some charge $85 a month, maybe some charge $100 because I don't know, maybe they provide dialysis. I don't know. The point is it's market driven and they can choose that. Maybe you choose that doctor because they got a medical school degree from somewhere that you like better than the other guy. Maybe they have 15 years more of experience, so they charge more. It's a free market. You can choose on your app. This is good for millennials too, by the way. We like stuff that's on apps. And so that's the end goal. How do you get there? How do you get doctors to transition? You have to have demand. Okay, so why don't we transition the subsidies that we're paying, with Medicaid and through federally qualified health centers towards an HSA that would be allowed to use for a DPC. Now you've got, we got some, somebody's been following some of this legislation. And I know David Ballot, my friend here at TPPF, is really hardcore about this, and has helped us a lot with some of our ideas. And so that's the goal. It's complicated on how to get there because operating within the legal system of healthcare is simply difficult. So that's what we're working on right now, so that when you're in medical school, you're thinking, well, I wanted to go be my community doctor, but it's not profitable. Now it would be. Now you know that it would be profitable. You're more likely to get into primary care because we're lacking primary care doctors in this country right now because there's no incentive to get in there. There's a lot more incentive to get into specialty care. So that's the end goal, and I think Republicans can really own that issue.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a piece. Chip, let me pull it back because the narrative from the left is threefold, twofold maybe. Republicans only want to take away everybody's health insurance and don't have any plan. And I know that you were involved in the Republican Study Committee that last year published a plan. It got little attention. What Dan said was a piece of that. Yeah. But just kind of real brief, can you, at a high level, give the vision of what y'all published, what's out there, what aligns with what Dan was talking about, and where we should be driving this discussion?
Yeah, and look, and I'm glad there's applause in this room, and it wouldn't surprise me, obviously, that there'd be general agreement with what Dan just outlined. He and I I think, are 100% in agreement on what we need to try to accomplish here, and that we need to be on offense on the messaging side of this, explaining to the American people what we're for and how much it benefits their lives. We've not done a good job of that, right? We've not gone out there and explained how this will literally transform their lives if we structure it the right way. You shouldn't have to go to an insurance bureaucrat any more than a government bureaucrat. Like, we're really good at making government bureaucrats the boogeyman. And we've got insurance companies that are out there doing, but we've got insurance companies you have to go to call to figure out your health care. Why? Why am I calling a 25-year-old in Omaha picking up a phone who goes down and tells me who's in network and who's not? And to Dan's point, trying to figure out I can get on my phone and find 30 places to change my oil within 5 miles of my house. I can go find veterinarians for my dogs. I can go find anything the free market wants to provide for me. But in healthcare, we've decided, no, let's constrain it. And let's make it virtually impossible to figure out. And then say, oh, we've got this great free market. We don't have a free market right now in healthcare. We don't, and we should stop pretending we do, and then have a solution that we can put forward. So Dan outlined DPC as that core component that's actually the building block. It's actually the foundation that we need to better talk about so that you can go to the doctor of your choice to get the care of your choice among abundant opportunities and options, and then go get that care. But the way you do that is you have to structure it in a way, cutting through the DC swamp, to find a way to create a plan that you can actually go sell and go work. And so we've worked through legislation. I actually introduced legislation last July called the Healthcare Freedom Act, which was designed to do just that, is to expand on direct primary care, break down the sort of stranglehold in the supply chains that insurance companies have, and allow us to have all of our dollars going into health savings accounts and have you control your health care. If you want to upend the whole problem with pre-existing conditions, and I'm a walking pre-existing condition, but guess what? Everyone is. And we have to sit here and go through and figure out how to have care. The problem is that we're stuck within this employer-provided health insurance model where you don't feel like you can hop from job to job and have ownership of your care, take that and go buy insurance of your choice and have it just like you do for your automobile insurance, your homeowner's insurance, your life insurance, and stuff that you carry with you portably. That is the actual main obstacle to having flexibility in getting the health care of your choice. So we've got a plan, and the RSC, we worked really hard in a group, and it's a pretty large group of people behind it that would now and create a system where we can have dollars being saved that you have control of, that you can take those dollars, go pay for a direct primary care doctor, go pay for example, health sharing ministries, the ability to defray costs among organizations that are highly successful right now in the wake of Obamacare, stripping away people's ability to be insured, the ability to have catastrophic insurance, the ability for an employer to provide into that health savings account the funding, still get the same tax deduction, but now you own it instead of your employer having to be a health management company along with the insurance. There are so many ways we can do this, but you've got to get the American people to understand how they're at the cusp in the 21st century of having an unbelievable wealth of options in healthcare right here. I mean, you can get the care, you can get your blood tested, you can figure out you can talk to an MD Anderson expert when you're 200 miles away, and you can do all of this stuff through technology if we'll just free it up and get both the government and insurance bureaucrats out of the way between you and your doctor.
So thank you. That's great remarks by both. That's also a plug for the specific healthcare focused panel later this afternoon. I hope y'all will join on that. Let me turn subjects now to energy policy, and just because it's the term that everybody uses, climate change. And we know that the left alleges that this impacts every aspect of our lives. In fact, a recent Washington Examiner article questioned whether climate change was the cause of the Prince Harry and Princess Meghan split from the royal family. As tempted as I am to ask for both of your thoughts on the royal monarchy, I won't. But I wanted to ask instead, and starting with you, Dan, about the proposal announced yesterday by House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy to address clean energy and emissions. And I saw on Twitter, you call this a third option. So Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the genesis of this plan, which I keep asking the minority leader to name the Clean Frontier, that's my goal. I want to get it named. You got to hashtag something. If you're going to have a plan, you got to have a hashtag.
It's got to go viral.
Yeah, you got to have messaging or marketing along with your messaging. And so right now it's a philosophy, and it's more than a philosophy. It's grounded in 12 bills coming out of ENC, and one of them is my bill, the Leading Act, which is a carbon capture for natural gas facilities bill. I'll get to that in a second. Let me explain the broader message here. We need a third option because if you do polling, if you ask both conservatives and liberals what they think about the environment, it's up there in concerns. Independence, it's number one. Healthcare and environment are the number one concerns for independents. We can make fun of the left's sort of alarmist views on climate change, and we should to an extent, but we can't ignore it completely. From a political standpoint, we cannot ignore it completely. And it's not totally untrue. Now, their alarmism is often, almost always, completely untrue and not founded in facts or data. When they're blaming storms and things on climate change, it's usually nonsense. That doesn't mean there isn't some effect on the climate from man-made emissions. And we could admit that and say, okay, well, we all have an interest in cleaner air and cleaner water and generally lowering emissions, because even if we don't know what it's doing to the environment, well, let's at least err on the side of caution, but it doesn't mean erring on the side of destroying our economy, which is what the left would have. And so two things. Grant some of the premise, not all of the premise that they're operating on, some of it, and expose them for what they're really trying to do, which is a complete socialist takeover of the economy. Because why else would you say, hey, no nuclear? Why would you, if you actually cared about carbon emissions, why would you say eliminate nuclear? Why would you be so against natural gas? The reason the United States has reduced emissions by like 15% over the last couple decades is because of technological innovation and fracking and use of natural gas. If we were to get China and India on our natural gas, well, we'd reduce emissions worldwide by like 40%. I think that was a DOE study. So the basic message is this: we're concerned with innovation, research, and development for greener energy. And we're concerned about 100% of global emissions. The left is just concerned about 15% of global emissions. What do I mean by that? The United States emits 15% of global emissions. You can destroy the US economy and you'll reduce global emissions by 15%. You'll take that out. Got it. And we'll all be suffering in poverty. But hey, they'll feel really good about their environmentalism. If you export American innovation to the world, we reduce 100% of carbon emissions. So what does that innovation look like? Again, my bill, the carbon capture technology. So there's a plant outside of Houston that takes in natural gas, creates electricity with it, captures the carbon, recirculates that through the generators, and has zero emissions as a result. Pilot programs like that are what my bill would fund. There's a similar one, a coal burning plant also outside of Houston that does carbon capture. So this isn't just pie in the sky thinking. This actually exists. It needs to be studied more. We need to make carbon dioxide a commodity, not a pollutant. When it's a commodity, well, the market starts to operate differently. We can use it for a lot of things, not just oil recovery, because there is oil recovery with carbon, but other things too, like farming, creation of cement, and even creation of certain fuels. That kind of technology needs to be researched more. There's a proposal to have a carbon capture energy hub at DOE. I think that's a good idea to start doing the basic science for this kind of stuff and really lead the world in it.
So let me, just because we're running a little bit short on time, Chip, I know you've had a lot to do in that area as well, but I want to conclude our keynote discussion today by looking forward. And let's go back and start with the impeachment proceedings. It's generally agreed that the Senate will acquit President Trump. But then my question is, so what? What happens next? And specifically, looking at your agenda for 2020, and if the GOP regains the House this election, what happens if we win? Chip?
Well, and I do want to say a note of apology. I would normally look at my phone. A message popped up. My wife was in a little car accident, so I was a little distracted. But she's fine. Everybody's good. So I was distracted. Forgive me for looking at my phone. We ought to be very laser focused on this point. I hear a lot from Republican leadership about how united we are right now, and I think that's an important point to make politically, and I think that it is a true statement that Republicans are generally very united right now, in significant part in rallying around and dealing with the impeachment effort, and that's brought a lot of unity. And I think there's increased unity across a number of different issues in a way that I hadn't seen in a while, which is good. But let's be clear. It was not that long ago that we utterly failed. 3 years ago, when Republicans had control of the House of Representatives, we utterly failed to do what we said we would do. And we cannot make that mistake again, period. We won't be given another shot. And so therefore, I think it is very important that we do build an agenda that we're out there marketing and pushing, and that we can also be held accountable for. I think that's important. I think the American people need to know what they're supporting and getting behind, and then be able to hold us to account to do it in a year. If the Republican House, if we want the House of Representatives to be in conservative hands, then we should get out and put a message out there that they'll get behind and then be held accountable for it. I believe, when I went out and campaigned last time, my campaign is going to be very similar this time. I campaigned on very simple things: securing the border of the United States and making sure that we've got the tools and resources necessary for Border Patrol, ICE, to be able to control the border and take it away from cartels. 2, making sure that we restore healthcare freedom, give people access to the care that they need, getting bureaucrats, both insurance and government, out of the way. 3, making sure that our men and women in uniform have a very clear mission. I think we need to work on that, and the tools to carry it out and the care when they get home. And then balancing the budget, doing our job on spending. And those 4 things are things that I focused on relentlessly. And then for the most part, my 5th thing I'll say is get Washington the hell out of the way and leave us alone. Let Texas do it. And so I think we need to, in something in that zip code, articulate it in a way that different members can grab pieces of that and run with to their strengths. That's where I land. I agree with Dan that I think we need to have a much stronger message on things like climate change and dealing with those issues. From my standpoint, I love what TPPF is doing with Life Powered, right? Because we're talking about the importance of clean, abundant energy to powering lives, making sure that babies and incubators here have actual energy pumping those bags instead of a doctor squeezing a bag in Uganda or someplace that doesn't have power available, making sure that we talk about how much we've got like 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to power right now, that we're all taking for granted because we have access to it here in the United States. And we have to remember that it is India and China that is driving the carbon production that people are concerned about, to the extent they're concerned about it, and not undermine our own economic well-being and national security in a fit of rage in response to what some on the left might be saying. We should be proud of what energy has done for Texas, proud of what energy is doing for the United States, export it proudly, and remember that carbon is not a pollutant. Carbon is natural. Carbon is good. Now, we can talk about what we need to do with trees and carbon capture or whatever we might need to do if that's necessary with respect to climate change, but we should go on offense, making sure people understand how critical those things are to our lives and our well-being and be unapologetic about it. I think when we are, then people lead and they follow and we win minds and hearts. And stop playing the political games. This isn't about getting back in power. It's about winning minds and hearts and building a movement so people will get behind you and then do what you said you would do so they can end the cynicism about Washington, D.C. I think that's what we should be doing.
Dan, I'll give you the last word. You're already a leader among the GOP and nationally. And if you find yourself in the majority party come January of 2021, do you feel that your side is ready to lead and ready to make that argument to the American people?
I hope so. I agree with Chip on what our priorities should be, especially with healthcare. If we don't come together and at least agree on a certain set of principles that we will fight for in a unified way on healthcare, we will fail again. And I wasn't there when we failed the last time. I don't know exactly what the inner workings were. But we have to figure that out. And again, this is why I'm so passionate about direct primary care, because I can explain it to people. It's really hard to explain a lot of the wonkier insurance reforms that we need to do to people. And it scares people because they're like, well, that means you're changing my insurance. It's fundamentally what that means. That scares people, and understandably so. Healthcare has to be a priority. The environmental plan I talked about, I mean, that's easy. They have gone so far left on the environmentalism. We have actual legislation. They don't. And if you read the Green New Deal, they don't have anything. It's not actual legislation. We have actual solutions and real technology that we want to put forth, and we just have to talk about it. We can't cede that ground. So I think as long as we focus on those things, I think we'll be ready to lead. But it's always easy to be unified in the minority. It's, as the Democrats are finding out, of course, it's difficult in the majority, and that is the nature of human nature and politics. And but I think we should keep talking about what those priorities are going to be, so that when it does come, the time does come, it's second nature.
That's great. Congressman Crenshaw, Congressman Roy, thank you guys for being us. Thank you for being at Policy Orientation. More to come. Thank you so much. Great discussion.